She was 22 and standing in the rain with nothing, no family safety net, no savings account, no forwarding address, just a battered canvas duffel bag and a crumpled $4 bill she had kept hidden inside the lining of her winter coat for 6 weeks. And with those $4, she bought a Victorian gramophone repair shop on a narrow side street in Oakhaven, Vermont. The front display window was shattered, the interior soaked, and the antique mahogany work table had partially collapsed. The county had condemned the building the previous spring, demolition scheduled for the following autumn. But what nobody knew was that stuck deep inside the curve of a giant brass horn hanging in the ruined shop window, sealed by a fitted brass collar that had not been turned in over 50 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're re-watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Elara Vance had been bracing for silence her whole life without knowing it. Childhood had not been a place of safety, but a relentless series of adjustments to conditions she did not choose. She grew up in a narrow rented house in a fading industrial town in upstate New York, a place where the air perpetually smelled of damp concrete, and the river that cut through the old manufacturing district ran the color of iron rust in the spring rain. The house itself was functional rather than comfortable, the rooms small and close, the windows single-paned and drafty from October through April. Stability was an aspiration that existed somewhere outside their particular circumstances, visible in the well-maintained yards of other streets, but persistently absent from their own. The only sanctuary in that house and in her life was the front parlour, which was entirely occupied by her grandfather, Julian Vance, and his music. Julian was a man of considerable quiet strength and considerable quiet grief, both of which he carried simultaneously without allowing either to become. He had been a cellist, not a famous one, but a working musician who had spent 40 years in symphony orchestras and chamber quartets, playing the lower register of the harmony, the foundation upon which the brighter melodies rested. Julian had a gift that the dampness of the rented house could not diminish. He could listen to any piece of recorded music, however scratchy or degraded the shellac record, and immediately identify its structure, the direction of the phrase, the way the instruments had been positioned around the microphone. This was not a merely aesthetic skill. It was a form of deep acoustic literacy, and he passed it to Elara the way some grandfathers passed down carpentry or gardening, through patient repetition and careful physical demonstration. Julian would bring remnant pieces of audio equipment home from the pawn shops, discarded tube amplifiers with blown capacitors, speaker cones with split paper, record players with seized motors. He and Elara would sit together at the small wooden table in the parlour under the overhead light, and Julian would show his granddaughter exactly how to assess damage. Not how to hide it, he would clarify, but how to genuinely repair it, so the mended mechanism was structurally as sound as the original. A visible repair done honestly is worth more than a concealed one, Julian told her on more than one occasion, guiding Elara's small fingers to feel the difference between a properly soldered joint and a cold solder that would eventually fail again under electrical stress. It was a lesson that Elara absorbed entirely, though she could not have articulated its broader implications at the time. She could feel the difference between honest work and the kind of work designed only to postpone a problem until it became someone else's problem to solve. Elara was 14 when Julian's hearing began to fail. The failure was not dramatic in the way deafness is portrayed in films. It was quiet, and that was what made it devastating. He did not lose volume first, he lost frequency. The high notes of the violins began to blur, then the sharp attack of the piano, until the music he had devoted his life to became a muffled, indistinct rumble. He stopped playing the cello. He sold it to pay the rent when her mother, who was chronically absent and chronically unreliable, lost her job at the logistics center. The silence that settled over the front parlour was not an empty silence. It was a heavy, pressurized absence of sound, the kind of silence that rings in the ears with the memory of what used to be. Elara repaired things whenever she could. It was the one activity that reduced the ambient anxiety of the household to a manageable height. She could sit in her small bedroom with the door closed and a broken mechanical clock or a seized phonograph motor in her hands, and the sharp, specific demands of the work, the necessity of tracking the gear ratios, of maintaining the correct tension in the mainspring, of cleaning the old grease from the pivot points, were demanding enough to displace everything else. She fixed small appliances for neighbours for small amounts of cash that she saved meticulously in an envelope inside her winter coat lining, a habit she had adopted without conscious thought as a buffer against the persistent unpredictability of her mother-s presence. She had just turned 22 when Julian finally passed away. His death was the removal of the final structural support in a house that had been leaning for a decade. The argument with her mother, when it finally arrived 2 weeks after the funeral, was not about grief but about utility. Elara had spent 3 hours repairing a neighbour S vacuum cleaner for $15, and her mother had found the money on the kitchen counter before she could put it in her coat. Her mother did not shout. She simply informed her, in the flat, carrying tone of someone who has exhausted their capacity for accommodation, that the rent was due, that the vacuum money was insufficient, and that the arrangement of Elara living there had run its useful course. The silence in the kitchen lasted long enough for Elara to understand that the equilibrium of the household had been calculated with a very specific margin, and without Julian's social security check, she fell outside. She packed her canvas duffel bag. She took her coat money, $4 remaining after she had paid for soldering wire and a replacement set of micro screwdrivers the week prior. She walked out into the rain that had been falling since mid-afternoon and did not look back at the house. She walked for a long time in the rain, the cold water soaking through her canvas jacket and her jeans, her duffel bag a heavy sodden weight over one shoulder. The streets of the industrial town were empty and very quiet, the rain flattening all ambient sound, so that her own footsteps seemed extraordinarily loud against the wet concrete. She had no destination. She had a direction, which was simply away, and for the first night that was the only navigation available to her. The next weeks were a brutal and clarifying education in the specific weight of having nothing. She slept in the covered entryways of commercial buildings on warmer nights and in the all-night laundromat on the coldest ones, folding herself into the orange plastic chairs while the machines ran their cycles around her. She ate when she could get meals, and when she could not, she did not. She discovered the particular discipline that deprivation imposes, how it narrows attention to the immediate and necessary, stripping away every concern that is not directly related to the mechanics of survival. She moved through 3 towns in the span of 5 weeks, following the road north toward the smaller, quieter settlements in Vermont, where the cost of basic subsistence was slightly lower than in the New York mill towns. She picked up 2 days of work at a farm stand outside Bennington, carrying heavy crates of late-season apples from the orchard to the display tables for $7 a day. A woman at a church in Manchester allowed her to sleep in the church hall for 4 nights in exchange for repairing the motorized mechanisms of the church's old standing fans, work Elara completed in a single afternoon that would have taken the church's regular handyman a full week. A hardware store owner in Rutland let her shelter under his loading dock awning during a particularly violent 3-day rainstorm without asking any questions or requiring any payment beyond the courtesy of being gone before he raised the loading doors at 7 in the morning. She carried the $4 like a talisman, not spending them even when she was most desperate, intuiting in some part of herself that the money represented not just currency but some fundamental threshold she was not yet ready to cross. She had lived below the line for weeks, but she had not yet reached absolute zero. The $4 were the evidence of that. It was in the public library in Oakhaven on a Thursday afternoon in late October that she found the advertisement. She had gone in primarily for the warmth and the electrical outlet near the periodicals section, where she could charge the old cell phone she carried, which had no service plan but still held a clock and a flashlight. She was leafing through a stack of local weekly papers that the library kept in a wooden rack near the entrance, old editions going back several months, when a small notice in the county property listings caught her. Property No. 12B, Foundry Street. Former commercial structure, Victorian Gramophone shop. Delinquent taxes, Boncham Condola. Structure condemned. County invites sealed bids. Elara read the notice a second time more slowly. Victorian Gramophone shop. The words had a specific texture in her mind, a quality of mechanical precision and acoustic resonance, the kind of deliberate engineering that did not belong to the era of disposable electronics. She thought about the way her grandfather's hands moved over a piece of broken machinery, certain and quiet, listening to the gears before he even touched. She thought about the canvas duffel bag sitting at her feet under the library table, heavy with the specific tools of her one genuine competence. She had $4. The delinquent tax was $4. She tore a small piece from the margin of the newspaper, a practice the library strictly prohibited, but Elara weighed the transgression against the alternative and made her choice, and wrote down the property address and the county clerk's contact information. She folded the paper precisely and put it in her jacket pocket. She sat for another hour, thinking through the logic of the situation. She had nowhere to sleep that night. She had no prospects for income beyond small, irregular repair work. She had a duffel bag and $4 and a mechanical skill that required a workbench to be worth anything at all. The math, such as it was, pointed in a single direction. She found a sheet of paper in a recycling bin near the printer station, addressed a bid to the county property office in careful, very neat handwriting. Her grandfather's musical notation handwriting had always been beautiful, and Elara was an unconscious imitation of it, and dropped the sealed envelope into the mail slot of the post office, 2 blocks from the library before the 5 o'clock collection. 12 days later, walking back to the library to check the general delivery window, she found a county envelope waiting for her. She stood on the post office steps and read it twice in the thin November light, the cold wind off the river cutting through her jacket. Her bid had been accepted. She had 3 days to appear at the county clerk's office, vacapite payment. She walked the full length of Oakhaven's main commercial street 3 times before she went in. Oakhaven was a small weathered Vermont town set in a narrow river valley between 2 low ridges of maple and white pine. The town had been built on a tradition of small-scale manufacture and stubborn thrift, visible in the construction of its commercial buildings, heavy granite foundations, dark brick upper story, deep overhanging eaves, designed by people who understood that the winter would be long, and the snow would be relentless. By late November, the maples on the ridges had shed their leaves entirely, and the birches stood white and bare against the dark. The air was completely cold, carrying a specific quality that New England air has in late autumn, clean and sharp and already containing the first faint molecular suggestion of ice. Elara walked into the Windham County Clerk's office on a Tuesday morning carrying her canvas duffel bag and wearing every layer of clothing she owned, which amounted to 2 pairs of socks, jeans, a thermal shirt, a denim jacket, and a wool coat from the church thrift bin in Manchester. She had $4 in her pocket, moved there from her coat lining that morning so she would not have to undress to retrieve it, and a county notification letter folded into her jacket. The clerk's office was a room that smelled of heated paper and old wood, the walls lined with heavy filing cabinets and bound volumes of county records going back a century and a half. The heating was loud, a radiator that knocked and hissed rhythmically but effectively. Elara stood at the counter for a moment, simply absorbing the warmth which she had not felt in a genuinely sustained way for some time. The county clerk was a woman named Ruth Barker, 61 years old, with a practical grey bun and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the deliberate, unhurried manner of a person who had processed every variety of human circumstance across 30 years behind the same counter. She looked at Morph Elara with the specific attention of someone who had learned to read situations efficiently, taking in the layered clothing, the wet canvas bag, the careful way the girl was holding herself upright against obvious exhaustion. "You here for the Foundry Street property," Ruth said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," Elara said. Ruth pulled a thick folder from a cabinet and laid it open on the counter. She turned pages with the methodical efficiency of long practice. "Mott need to go over some things with you before we proceed," she said in a tone that was not unkind but was absolutely clear about its intent. "That building has been closed since Mortninchin Nummitam. The previous owner, Silas Thorne, died in Mortninchin Salmitu. The estate never settled the property, and the county has been carrying it on delinquent tax rolls for decades. The structure itself is late 19th century construction, which means it was built roughly around Mornin Tam Chin Milam. The front display window has been broken since at least Hein Kum Cham Num. There is documented water intrusion in the ground floor. The roof lost several sections of slate in a storm 3 years ago and has not been repaired." "Mott understand," Elara said. "You cannot live in a condemned structure without an occupancy permit," Ruth continued, watching Elara S. face. "The county inspector would need to assess the property and approve repairs before granting occupancy. That process takes time and requires demonstrated work." "Mott know how to repair mechanical damage," Elara said. Then paused, hearing the inadequacy of the statement in the context of a building with a broken window and a compromised roof. "Mort learn other things quickly." Ruth studied her for a long, quiet moment. "May Mott ask your age?" 22, Elara said. Ruth looked at her for another moment, then pulled a standard deed transfer form from the folder. "Do you have the $4? Elara reached into her pocket and produced 4 deeply creased, slightly damp dollar bills. She laid them on the counter with both hands, as deliberately as she could manage. Ruth smoothed the bills flat, placed them in the cash drawer, stamped the deed form twice with a brass stamp that landed with the sound of a decision being made, and signed her name in blue ink. She slid the deed across the counter. "The key is on a hook by the back door of the property," she said. "The front lock has worked since the 70s. You need to go around the alley." She paused. "Foundry Street is 2 blocks east and 3 south. The building has a dark red door, or it did. The paint may have gone by now." Then she did something unexpected. She reached under the counter and produced a folded brown paper bag. "Mott brought too much lunch," she said. "Turkey sandwich and an apple. The sandwich will just go stale." Elara took the bag. She said thank you twice. Once immediately and once from the door. She went around the corner and stood in the alley doorway of the old Gramophone shop and ate the sandwich in 6 bites, standing up, before she allowed herself to look at anything else. The building at the end of Foundry Street was narrow and tall, 2 stories, built of dark red brick with a decorative pressed tin facade at street level that had weathered to a patchy mottled grey-green. The front window, or Vekep Hatta Te, had been the front window, was a wide, curved bay design that must have been elegant in its original state, intended to display heavy mahogany gramophones and gleaming brass horns to pedestrians on the street. The glass was gone, replaced imperfectly with a sheet of corrugated metal screwed to the window frame at irregular intervals, gaps visible along the edges where the wind and weather had worked their way inside without invitation. Above the window, faint gold lettering was still barely legible on the dark brick. S. Thorne, gramophones and cylinders, sti mortam chin mi lam. The red door in the alley was a very dark, weathered red, nearly black, set in a heavy brick archway with a small canopy over it that was missing its outermost edge. The key hung on a bent nail exactly as Ruth Barker had said. It was a thick, heavy iron key of the type specific to the late 19th century, the kind of key cast from a single moldve kepite hat a square bow. Elara took it from the nail, inserted it in the lock, and felt the mechanism engage with the particular resistance of a mechanism that had not been turned in a very long time. She applied slow, steady pressure, not force but patience, and the tumblers eventually yielded, the bolt sliding back with a sound that was more resonant than a click, more like a small, definite statement. The door swung inward on hinges that needed oil but did not need replacement. The smell that came out was complex and immediately legible to someone who had grown up around old machines: damp wool, dry shellac, oxidized brass, aged machine oil, and beneath all of that, faintly but distinctly, the particular clean smell of old oak, which is resistant to moisture in a way that ordinary wood is not. She stepped inside and let her eyes adjust. The ground floor was a single long room, narrower than it appeared from outside, running from the alley entrance all the way through to the boarded front window. The ceiling was pressed tin, the same material as the facade, patterned in overlapping squares that were darkened with age but structurally intact. The walls were panelled in tongue-and-groove oak, a wood that had darkened to a deep, rich brown over a century, its grain still visible beneath decades of accumulated grime. Heavy built-in display shelves ran the length of the right wall from floor to ceiling, designed originally to hold completed gramophones and rows of cylinder records. An antique mahogany work table, perhaps 10 feet long, occupied the centre of the room. One heavy turned leg had given way at the joint, and the table rested at a mild but noticeable tilt, the dropped corner resting on the floor. A second table along the left wall held a row of what looked like small lathes and specialized mechanical presses, their iron bases elaborately scrolled and cast in patterns that had been beautiful once and were still, under the rust and grime, beautiful now. Elara set her canvas bag on the tilted work table and walked the length of the room slowly, touching nothing, simply assessing. She had no heat, no running water, no electricity, and the front window was open to the November air through the gaps in the corrugated metal covering. The temperature inside the building was several degrees colder than outside, because the thick brick walls retained cold the way they retained heat in summer, with complete indifferent efficiency. But the bones were right. The ceiling was intact. The floor, wide maple planks worn smooth by a century of foot traffic, showed no signs of structural failure when she walked them carefully. The walls were damp along the lower 8 inches where the floor met the panelling, but the oak panels above that line were dry and firm. The damage was real, but it was not structural. It was the difference between a machine with a slipped gear and a machine with a cracked engine block. The former was fixable, the latter was scrapped. In the far corner, near the boarded window, a wood-burning stove sat on a brick pad. It was a late Victorian parlour model, cast iron, cylindrical, with a decorative finial on top and small mica windows in the door through which the fire would have been visible. The stovepipe connected to a chimney flue built into the brick wall. Elara found the stove damper handle, turned it experimentally, and felt it move with a slight resistance that meant the damper was operational but stiff. She opened the stove door. The interior was ash-free, suggesting the stove had been cleaned before the shop was closed, and the cast-iron surfaces, while dull with oxidization, were sound. She gathered what dry material she could find, 2 sheets of aged newspaper from under the mahogany table, a handful of broken stickwood from a small pile near the back door, and several pieces of what appeared to be discarded wooden shipping crate, dry and pale from decades inside the sheltered room. She built a small fire in the cast-iron stove with the deliberateness of someone who had learned in the past weeks that small amounts of combustible material needed to be treated with absolute respect. The fire caught, the newspaper flaring quickly, the dry stickwood engaged. She closed the stove door and left the damper half open to dry. She returned to the work table, lifted her canvas bag to the higher end, and sat on the floor with her back against the oak panelling, facing the growing warmth from the stove. She was inside, out of the rain, with a fire and wall. She pulled her knees to her chest and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 weeks, to breathe without any immediate calculation attached. She looked at the display shelves along the right wall and noticed, for the first time, that they were not entirely empty. Near the top of the front section, hung from a heavy iron bracket mounted to the ceiling joist, was a single brass horn. It was massive, perhaps 3 feet long and 2.5 feet across the bell, the kind used on the earliest concert phonographs to amplify the sound mechanically before the era of electronic amplification. The brass had oxidized to a dull, uneven brown with patches of verdigris, but the shape was perfectly intact, a graceful, sweeping flare designed mathematically to propagate acoustic waves with maximum efficiency. It hung there in the gloom of the shop like an enormous muted trumpet waiting for a sound to carry. The whole object had the quality of a thing that had been engineered for a specific, irreplaceable purpose, and was now approaching the final condition of unmaintained metal, which is silence. The first 3 days were a strict education in what could and could not be deferred. Water could not be deferred, which meant learning the location of the public restroom at the county library, 2 blocks away, and the outdoor spigot at the back of the hardware store on Main Street, whose owner, a man named Carl Whitfield, she had not yet met, but whose unlocked spigot she had already used twice for washing water, with the specific guilty efficiency of someone who intends to make things right when able. Food could be deferred somewhat, which she was already experienced with. Cold could be managed but not eliminated with the small cast-iron stove, which she was learning to operate with a miser-esque precision, burning only what she absolutely needed to maintain a temperature that kept her function. The compromised front window was the most immediately dangerous vulnerability, allowing a steady infiltration of cold air through the gaps in the corrugated metal covering, and she spent the better part of the second morning stuffing those gaps with strips of heavy felt material she found folded in a wooden crate under the work table, material that had the quality of industrial dampening fabric stored properly for a long temps, épis dry, still holding its structure. On the morning of the 3rd day, she walked up Main Street to Whitfield S. Hardware and introduced herself. Carl Whitfield was a man in his mid-60s who had operated the store for 38 years, the kind of man whose entire bearing communicated a straightforward assessment of the world as a place that rewarded honest work and punished careless work in roughly equal and predictable proportion. He had a wide face, large hands, and a habit of listening with his full attention, which is rarer than it sounds. He looked at Elara carefully when she explained her situation, that she had purchased the Foundry Street property, that she needed to establish a line of credit, and that she could work off the debt doing mechanical repairs for any customers who needed it at a rate they could agree on. "The Thorne shop," Carl said. He leaned his forearms on the wooden counter and considered this. "Silas Thorne was my grandfather's friend. Used to fix the phonographs for the whole county. Knew every gear and spring in those machines. Quality work." He looked at Elara. "What do you know about phonograph repair?" "Motkanoove kept mechanical linkages and acoustic propagation," Elara said. "Spring tension, gear ratios, acoustic isolation. The specific parts of the gramophone's mot can learn from the tools in the shop. There are manuals. Carl studied her face for a long moment, the particular attention of a man evaluating something he was genuinely uncertain about. Then he pulled a ledger from under the counter and wrote her name at the top of a clean page. You can work off credit at $7 an hour fixing small motors and appliances. Mutluglunk send people over when they come in asking. Don't expect a flood. He put the ledger away. Mutluglunk bring some dry hardwood splits by this afternoon for the stove. You shouldn't be burning furniture. Elara had not been burning furniture, but she had been burning some things that were in the shop that she should have been burning, and she did not argue the point. Carl brought the hardwood splits that afternoon, and also, without commentary, a gallon of drinking water in a plastic jug and a small metal tin of shortbread cookies that he set on the work table, without looking at Elara directly, in the manner of a person performing an act of care who finds direct acknowledgement of that act uncomfortable. Over the following week, while the temperature outside dropped steadily toward the serious cold of the Vermont December, Elara conducted a thorough, methodical inventory of the shop's contents. She worked systematically, beginning at the front display section and moving to the back workroom. The display shelves held very little beyond several stripped gramophone cabinets, heavy oak and mahogany boxes missing their mechanical works, waiting for motors that had never been rebuilt. The mahogany work table, once she propped its broken corner with a salvaged brick and levelled it approximately true, revealed several shallow drawers running along its length. The drawers contained the material record of Silas Thorne's professional life. Precision screwdrivers in graduated sizes, boxes of steel phonograph needles, small tins of mainspring graphite grease that had dried to solid blocks, a set of specialized pliers for bending governor springs, and hundreds of tiny brass screws sorted into small glass vials. The back workroom was separated from the display room by a narrow doorway with a heavy canvas curtain, now grey with age, that had served as an acoustic barrier. Behind it, the workroom held 3 heavy cast-iron workbenches and a long testing table made of solid maple. On a shelf above the testing table stood a row of wooden cylinder mandrels in various sizes, used for holding the fragile wax and celluloid records during testing, and beside them, precisely arranged in a wooden rack, a complete set of acoustic reproducers, the delicate mechanisms that translated the needle S vibration into sound waves. Elara examined the reproducers with particular care, laying them out on the testing table. They were built with extraordinary precision, the mica diaphragms intact, the rubber gaskets hardened but replaceable, the tiny stylus bars engineered with the confident exactness of someone who understood that acoustic fidelity depended entirely on these microscopic tolerances. They represented decades of refined professional knowledge, the cumulative experience of a man who had understood the specific mechanical requirements of a device that needed to extract music from a groove no wider than a human head. Elara sat at the testing table and looked at the mechanisms spread around her for a long time, saying nothing. It was on the 7th day, a Thursday, while she was engaged in the specific task of cleaning the giant brass horn that she had been putting off, because she recognized it as something that deserved care and time she had not previously been able to give it, that she made her discovery. She had unhooked the brass horn from its sealing bracket, with both hands struggling slightly under its awkward weight, bringing it down to the mahogany work table to assess the oxidation before attempting any polish. The brass was genuinely tarnished in several areas, deep verdigris where moisture had settled, and a larger dull patch near the bell where the metal had been handled repeatedly. The structure was sound. She had checked the seams individually. The horn itself would require substantial elbow grease before it could be considered restored, but the acoustic shape, as with the building, was right. The narrow end of the horn where it would connect to the gramophone S tone arm ended in a heavy brass collar approximately 3 inches in diameter. It was elaborately decorated with a knurled pattern, oxidized to a deep, uneven brown that showed gold at the ridges where handling had kept the metal polished. Inside the collar, rather than the expected hollow opening, there was a fitted brass plug sitting flush with the. Elara held the horn in one hand and traced the edge of the brass plug with the fingers of her other hand, and out of an instinct that she could not have explained, some combination of the mechanical literacy her grandfather had passed to her and the particular alertness that weeks of scarcity had honed in her, she pressed her thumbs against the knurled collar and applied a twisting pressure. It moved. Not a great deal. Perhaps a quarter turn. But it moved, with the slight resistance of a threaded fitting that has not been engaged in a very long time, and Elara felt immediately and with complete certainty that this movement was intentional, that the plug was not a permanent seal but a threaded cap, and that something was inside the horn below it. She set the horn on the work table and stood very still for a moment, her hands resting at her sides. Then she gripped the collar firmly, planted her feet, and applied a slow, steady rotational force to the brass plug. It resisted for several turns with the specific friction of a fine thread that had been sealed against moisture by decades of oxidation building up in the gaps. And then, quite suddenly, the resistance gave way, and the plug came free in her hand with a soft, clean pop of equalized pressure. She looked down into the dark throat of the horn. Lodged a few inches inside, tight against the narrowing curve of the brass, was a cylindrical object wrapped in dark green felt. She reached in with 2 fingers, pinched the edge of the felt, and pulled gently. It was wedged tight. She retrieved a long pair of forceps from the work table drawer, gripped the felt firmly, and worked the object back and forth until it slid free of the brass taper. She brought it out into the light and set it on the work table. It was a cylindrical package, about 6 inches long and 3 inches in diameter, wrapped tightly in industrial felt and bound with copper wire. The weight of it was surprising, heavy and dense, and beneath the felt cylinder, wedged further down the throat of the horn, was another object, a standard cardboard tube of the type used to store early phonograph cylinders. Its exterior label faded to illegibility. Elara sat down on the work table stool very slowly. She picked up the felt cylinder first. She used her wire cutters to snip the copper bindings, unwrapped the green felt, and found a layer of heavy waxed paper. Inside the paper was a dense roll of paper currency, bound with a rubber band that had long since disintegrated into a ring of dark, brittle fragments that crumbled when she touched them. The currency was old. She could tell from the appearance immediately, the smaller portraits and the particular shade of green that predated the modern redesigns. She counted Eagze hat stack with careful hands. The bills were uncirculated, still crisp despite their age, preserved in the airtight interior of the brass horn away from light and moisture. When she was finished counting, she counted again, because the first total seemed incorrect. It was not incorrect. $38,000 in vintage $100 bills had been stored inside the brass horn of a Victorian gramophone for an unknown number of decades, waiting with the patience of hidden things for the moment of their discovery. She set the money on one side of the work table and picked up the cardboard tube. She removed the lid with extreme care. The cardboard was dry and fragile and slid out the contents. It was a brown wax recording cylinder, the fragile medium of the Motentam Chimigay, before shellac discs became the standard. The wax was pristine, undisturbed by fungus or temperature damage, its grooved surface holding the physical impression of acoustic waves captured more than half a century ago. Tucked inside the hollow centre of the wax cylinder was a tightly rolled piece of cream-coloured paper. Elara drew it out, unrolled it carefully, and found a note written in a precise, mechanical script, the letters perfectly spaced. She placed the paper on the work table beside the money and the wax cylinder. She walked to the cast-iron stove and added 2 pieces of hardwood to the fire. She stood for a moment with her back to the warmth, looking at the 3 objects on the work table, the money, the wax recording, the letter, and understood that she was standing at a specific threshold, the kind that cannot be uncrossed once you step through. She had found money enough to change her material situation completely. She had found a pristine wax cylinder recording, an artifact of extreme fragility that had survived against all probability. She had found a letter from a man who had known, when he sealed these things inside the brass horn and hung it from the ceiling joist and closed the shop for the last time, that someone would eventually. She did not open the letter that night. She wrapped the money in a piece of clean canvas from her duffel bag, secured it with a length of copper wire she found in the display drawer, and placed it inside her bag in the bottom corner beneath her tool. She returned the wax cylinder to its cardboard tube with careful hands. She placed the letter on the shelf above the testing table in the back workroom, propped against the row of wooden mandrels, where she could see it from anywhere in the room. She was not ready for the letter. She needed 1 night in between the finding and the reading, 1 night to let the air settle around the discovery before adding the weight of the words inside. She lay on her improvised bed, a folded heavy moving blanket from the corner of the back room over the maple floor, her canvas jacket as a pillow, 2 layers of the acoustic curtain as a blanket, and listened to the sounds of Oakhaven at night. The wind in the pine trees at the top of Foundry Street, the distant, occasional sound of a vehicle on Main Street, the small domestic sound of the cast-iron stove cooling as the fire died down to coals. She was 22 years old and had $4 in taxes as her total financial history in this place, and $38,000 from a brass horn lying under her canvas tools, and a letter she hadn't read yet, and a building that needed a front window and a roof repair, and a dozen other things she would figure out one by one. Some machines are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The morning arrived with a pale, clear light that comes in New England in the last days before the serious winter snow sets in, a brilliant, thin light with no warmth in it, the kind that illuminates everything with extraordinary clarity and carries the cold in every photon. Elara woke before it was fully light, built the fire back from coals, and spent 20 minutes doing the practical morning tasks she had developed into a reliable sequence over the past week. Water from the jug, simple food from what she... a careful assessment of the fire's needs for the coming hours. Then she went to the shelf above the testing table and took down the unrolled piece of cream-coloured paper. She smoothed it flat on the testing table. The mechanical script was sharp and legible, written in black fountain pen ink that had not faded. To the mechanic who finds this. Mott have spent my life repairing the mechanisms that capture and reproduce human sound. Mott began this work in Motentam Chimi Lam when the cylinder was the only medium, and Mott have continued it through the transition to discs, the introduction of electrical recording, and the proliferation of the radio. Mott have watched the machinery of sound evolve from a mechanical wonder into an everyday appliance. My name is Silas Thorne. Mott am writing this in Motincham Nami Bay. Mott am 78 years old, and my hands no longer possess the steady precision required to set a reproducer stylus or tension, a governess. A mechanic whose hands shake is a danger to the machine, and Mott have always believed that the primary obligation of the repairman is to do no harm. Therefore, Mott am closing the shop. Mott leave the money because the bank requires paperwork and heirs, and Mott have neither. The money is the accumulated surplus of 60 years of charging a fair price for honest labour, living simply, and finding satisfaction in the work itself rather than what the work could buy. It is placed here, in the throat of an Motnin Tam Chinmitam concert horn, because only someone who understands the value of the old acoustic machines would take the time to clean it properly and discover the sealed collar. If you have found it, you are that person. The wax cylinder accompanying this note is a blank Mort recorded myself using an Edison Class M machine shortly before Mort sealed the horn. It requires an acoustic machine capable of playing 2-minute brown wax cylinders to be heard. If you are the mechanic Mott hope you are, there is an Edison Triumph in the back corner of the workroom under a canvas tarp. Its mainspring is broken, the governor weights are detached, and the reproducer needs a new glass diaphragm. Fix it. Then play the cylinder. The tools in this shop are the best that could be acquired in my lifetime. The lathes are true, the presses are calibrated, the parts inventory is organized by thread pitch and diameter. The oak paneling of these walls was chosen specifically for its acoustic properties, to warm the sound of the machines played in the front room. Do not paint over it. You will find that the world increasingly values things that are disposable, that break quickly and are replaced cheaply. This shop was built on the opposing principle that a well-engineered machine, properly maintained, can outlast its maker and continue to perform its function across generations. The building is yours if you can hold it. The tools are yours if you know how to use them. Silas Thorne, Mechanic. Written on the 12th day of November. Motnin Chinchum Nommi Bay. Elara read the letter through once, then read it again, her eyes tracking the precise, evenly spaced words. She did not cry. The emotion was something more specific and less immediate than grief or joy. It was the sensation of being addressed directly by a mind that operated on the same mechanical logic as her own. Someone who had considered the specific shape of the unknown recipient and aimed their words precisely at that shape. It was the feeling of being unexpectedly and entirely understood by someone she had never met. She went to the back corner of the workroom, where a heavy canvas tarp was draped over a bulky object on a low table. She pulled the tarp back, raising a cloud of dust that danced in the sharp morning light. Beneath it sat an Edison Triumph phonograph, a magnificent machine from the early Munin J, its heavy oak cabinet housing a massive double-spring motor designed to play the early wax cylinders with unwavering speed. She tested the winding crank. It spun freely, offering no resistance. The mainspring was indeed broken. She examined the governor assembly beneath the carriage mechanism. The tiny weights that regulated the motor S-speed through centrifugal force were detached, lying loose in the grease pan. She lifted the reproducer, an Edison Model C, and saw that the fragile glass diaphragm inside was shattered into 3 pieces. Silas Thorne had left her not just a message, but a test of competence. She went outside onto Foundry Street and stood in the cold morning, the clear winter light on her face. Across the narrow street, a brick wall of an old textile mill held the light in very fine, detailed lines against the pale sky. She stood there until she was properly cold and then went back inside and put 2 pieces of hardwood on the floor. She spent the rest of the morning assessing the tools and parts she would need to repair the Triumph. And then, in the afternoon, she went to the hardware store. Before we continue, Mott want to ask you something. Think of the best piece of advice you ever received from someone who had no obligation to give it, a stranger, an acquaintance, someone who simply chose to share what they knew. Leave it in the comments. These things matter more than people realize, and reading them reminds the rest of us to pay them forward. Carl Whitfield looked up from the counter when Elara pushed through the door. She had the letter in her jacket pocket. Mott found some things in the shop, she said. Carl waited. There was money in the brass concert horn. A significant amount. She paused. Mott want to know if there's anything Mott need to do legally before Mott use it. If there's an estate, or a claim, or something Mott met not aware of. Carl was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was doing something real, with the question he'd been asked. Silas died in Mutninchinsomi too, he said. The estate was settled eventually. There wasn't much of it, just some personal effects. The county took the property back for taxes because no heir stepped forward. If the money was in the building and the building transferred to you by legitimate deed, Mott D say you have a reasonable claim. But you should talk to Vera Kimball on County Road before you do anything. She is a notary, but she knows the law. He paused. Was there anything else? A letter, Elara said. And a wax recording cylinder he made. He told me to fix his Edison Triumph and play it. Carl nodded slowly. Silas was a precise man. If he left a recording, he had a reason. Elara walked to Vera Kimball's office that afternoon and spent an hour in a warm room going over the situation with a woman who combined legal precision with the particular matter-of-fact warmth of someone who had spent many years making the law comprehensible to people who found it intimidating. Vera confirmed that the transfer of property by county deed carried the contents of the property with it, that no estate claim remained on the Foundry Street building or its contents, and that Elara's claim to everything inside the building was clean and defensible. She typed up a short notarized statement to that effect, charged Elara $12 which Elara paid from her work credit account with Carl, and sent her on her way. Elara walked to the Independent Bank on Main Street and deposited $31,000. She kept $7,000 in the canvas duffel bag. She had a plan. The roof had lost several sections of slate in a storm that Carl Whitfield described as having arrived from the north 2 years previous, with the kind of wind that did not behave like normal Vermont wind. Several sections of slate missing from a roof in Vermont's winter is not an aesthetic problem. It is a structural one because snow and ice do not require large openings to cause serious water damage, only small ones allowed to persist. Elara spent 2 days on the roof in the first week of December, working in temperatures that required 2 pairs of socks and a borrowed set of insulated work gloves from Carl S. store. She had purchased replacement slate tiles, salvaged matching Vermont grey slate from a demolition yard down the valley, and the specific copper roofing nails required for correct installation, at a total cost of $85, which she noted in a small spiral notebook she had started keeping as a running account of every expenditure and every hour of labour. She had spent an afternoon at the library reading about slate roof repair and another afternoon watching Carl S. employee, a quiet young man named Thomas, demonstrate the specific use of a slate ripper tool to remove the broken pieces and the technique of sliding the new slate into place on a piece of demonstration board Carl kept behind the counter. The installation itself was slow, cold, and required a physical confidence at height that Elara had to develop through the discomfort of not having. She wore a safety rope tied to the brick chimney stack, which was sound, and she moved across the roof with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided that caution is not the same as fear, and that proceeding carefully is not the same as not proceeding. The replacement sections required attention to the alignment of the existing courses, matching the exposure exactly to the surrounding tiles so the finished repair was structurally sound against water infiltration. When she climbed down after the second day and stood on Foundry Street looking up at the result, the replacement slates were indistinguishable from the rest of the roof. The salvaged grey slate matched the weathered colour of the original perfectly. The repair was invisible, but structurally. Silas Thorne, no relation to Silas, but a local contractor from the next town over, who had come by to assess an unrelated matter for Carl and had watched her work from the alley without introducing him, told Carl afterward that the girl on the gramophone shop roof had more mechanical sense than most of the roofers he de-hired in the past decade. Carl did not immediately tell Elara this, but he eventually did, and she wrote it in the spiral notebook. Throughout December, while managing the cold and the immediate building repairs, Elara had spent her evenings at the mahogany work table, slowly restoring the Edison Triumph. The broken mainspring was a dangerous repair. A tightly coiled steel phonograph spring holds massive kinetic energy, and a sudden release can shatter bone or slice through flesh. She found a replacement spring in Silas Thorne's meticulously organized parts drawers, identifying the exact correct size by measuring the barrel diameter and arbor hook. Wearing heavy leather gloves and safety glasses, she carefully unwound the broken pieces of the old spring from the barrel, cleaned the decades of hardened graphite grease out with solvent, and coaxed the new spring into the confined space. A grueling physical process that required intense grip strength and absolute concentration. The Governor Assembly was delicate work. She reattached the centrifugal weights to the thin blued steel springs, using tiny brass screws she selected Veikepitehat tweezers from the glass vials. Adjusting the tension until the governor disc spun perfectly true, without a millimeter of wobble. The reproducer required acoustic precision. She found a replacement circular glass diaphragm in a protective wooden box on the shelf. She removed the hardened rubber gaskets from the reproducer shell, cut new ones from a sheet of specialized rubber tubing, placed the glass diaphragm carefully between them, and reconnected the fragile stylus bar to the center of the glass with a microscopic drop of melted wax, sealing the acoustic chamber. On a freezing Tuesday night in mid-January, with the cast-iron stove burning hot and the wind howling down Foundry Street, she finished the reassembly. She set the heavy oak cabinet back onto the table, attached the restored reproducer to the carriage arm, and fitted a small brass horn, not the giant concert horn, but a standard listening horn, onto the mount. She engaged the winding crank. It turned smoothly, the heavy double-spring motor, taking up tension Veikepite, heart a satisfying deep mechanical clicking. She wound it fully, released the brake, and watched the mandrel spin. It rotated silently, the governor weights expanding outward perfectly, holding the speed at an unwavering Mocham-Saumi revolutions per minute. She went to the shelf and retrieved the brown wax cylinder from its cardboard tube. Her hands were steady, but she felt the immense weight of the moment. She slid the cylinder onto the spinning tapered mandrel, pushing it gently until it seated firmly. She lowered the carriage arm, bringing the sapphire stylus of the reproducer down onto the surface of the spinning wax. There was a moment of mechanical surface noise, a deep, rhythmic rushing sound of the sapphire tracking the groove. And then, clear and present in the cold room, filling the oak-panelled space with astonishing acoustic presence, a voice spoke from the brass horn. Testing. Silas Thorne recording. November 12th, 1957. The voice was deep, gravelly, but resonant, carrying the specific timbre of an older man speaking clearly into a recording diaphragm. If you are hearing this, the Triumph is running true, and the reproducer diaphragm is seated correctly. You have passed the examination. A short pause, filled with the rushing sound of the wax. Mott leave you this shop not as a museum, but as a workshop. The machines we fix were built to capture human expression and hold it against time. But they are machines, and machines fail. When they fail, the music stops. The repairman's job is not just turning screws. It is ensuring that the voices of the past are not silenced by mechanical neglect. Another pause. Elara stood perfectly still, listening. My grandfather told me once that music does to die. It's just waiting for someone to put the needle down. He was right. But someone has to make sure the needle tracks, the motor turns, and the horn amplifies. That is the work. It is quiet work, and often unappreciated, but it is necessary work. Do it well. The voice stopped. The surface noise continued for another 30 seconds, and then the cylinder ended. Elara lifted the reproducer arm and engaged the brake. The mandrel spun to a silent halt. She sat on the stool in the quiet shop, the heat from the stove pressing against her back. She thought of her grandfather, Julian, his cello silenced by deafness, his hands repairing broken radios in the damp house. She thought of the acoustic literacy he had given her, the ability to hear the mechanical truth beneath the noise. She understood with absolute clarity that she had not just bought a building for $4, she had inherited a vocation. Some machines are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The wide maple floor original to the Motnin Tam Chin Milam construction had withstood a century of foot traffic and decades of water infiltration from the compromised front window, with a durability that testified to the quality of the old growth timber it was milled from. It was filthy and scarred, and in the lower front section, near the boarded window, the boards were discoloured from long moisture exposure, and several showed surface checking along the grain. But the boards were solid, no softness, no spring, no evidence of rot in the substructure below. Elara rented a drum sander from a rental yard in Bennington for $16 a day, the rate she had confirmed by calling ahead, and drove back to Oakhaven in the bed of Carl S. delivery truck, which he offered on the grounds that the rental yard was in the same direction as his Tuesday supply. She worked the sander across the ground floor in 3 progressive grits over 2 days, wearing a fitted dust mask and safety glasses that Carl had included in the bag of supplies without being asked. The sanding transformed the floor in the specific way that this process always transforms old wood. What had appeared to be damage revealed itself, under the layers of grime and surface wear, as the patina of genuine age, the wood beneath it dense and beautifully grained, the old growth rings so close together they were nearly invisible, evidence of a very slow-growing tree that had been harvested at its most structurally perfect moment. She finished the floor with 3 coats of amber shellac, working on her hands and knees, the sharp, clean smell filling the shop with a quality that felt very different from the damp, stale smell of recent months. The oak wall panelling responded to a careful cleaning with a mild solvent and fine steel wool in the same way the floor had responded to sanding. The underlying quality had been there all along, waiting under the accumulated evidence of neglect. The front window frame itself, once she had removed the corrugated metal covering that had served as its substitute for more than 15 years, revealed a structure that was still sound in the mullions and the sill, though the glass itself was gone from every pane. She ordered replacement glass from a glazier in Brattleboro who specialised in historic buildings, standard float glass in the correct thickness to match the remaining window frames in the upper story, and spent a week installing the new panes with oil-based glazing compound, a skill she had learned from a library book on historical window restoration. The restoration of the front bay window was the transformation that changed the shop-S relationship with the street. Before, the corrugated metal had made the building-S ground floor read as closed, abandoned, turned inward on itself. The new glass, installed over 3 days in late February, changed this immediately and entirely. Foundry Street caught the morning light from the east, and from 7 in the morning until noon, the shop front received a direct, clear illumination that travelled through the new panes and fell across the restored maple floor and the oak panelling in long. golden squares that moved slowly as the earth turned. People walking past on Foundry Street began to stop and look in. Not many people used Foundry Street. It was a secondary street, not on the main commercial route. But those who did use it had developed the habit of not looking at the Thorne shop, because for a long time there had been nothing to look at, only dark metal and the suggestion of interior disorder. Now there was something to look at, and they looked. Carl mentioned to Elara that old Mrs. Higgins, who walked her terrier along Foundry Street every morning at 8, had told Carl that she'd stopped twice in 1 week to look at the shop. Carl said Mrs. Higgins was not a woman who stopped for many things, and that Elara should take this as a reasonable measure of the quality of her work. Elara took it as a measure and wrote it in the spiral notebook. With the building secured against the weather and the interior surfaces restored, Elara turned her attention to the giant brass horn. She spent 2 weeks in March polishing it. She used a mild acid wash first to cut through the heavy verdigris, working carefully with gloves and ventilation, then switched to a fine brass polish and soft cotton rags. She polished for 3 hours every evening after finishing her mechanical repair work for Carl S. customers. The process was slow and physically taxing, her shoulders aching from the sustained pressure required to bring the dull metal back to. But as the days passed, the horn began to glow. First a deep, warm bronze colour emerged, and then as she worked finer and finer polishing compounds into the metal, it achieved a brilliant mirror-like gold finish. When it was finally done, she rehung it from the heavy iron bracket on the ceiling joist in the front display window. It dominated the space, a massive, gleaming acoustic funnel that caught the morning light and reflected it back onto the street in warm, golden flash. The community that assembled itself around the Gramophone shop on Foundry Street did not declare itself as such. It arrived quietly, incrementally, in the specific way that small-town community forms when something genuinely new and earnest appears in a familiar landscape. The people who came were not doing Elara a favour in any organised or deliberate sense. They were responding to a presence they found, in various ways and for various reasons worth responding to. Silas Thorne, the contractor who had watched her roof repair, came into the shop on a Tuesday afternoon in March, without introduction, carrying a heavy cardboard box. He walked the length of the front room looking at the restored panelling and the refinished floor and the gleaming brass horn without saying anything, and then he turned to Elara and said, "My grandfather was Silas' cousin. When the county closed the shop, my father took this box out of the back room, said it should go to the dump. He set the box on the work table. Mott reckon it belongs here now." He nodded once and left. Elara opened the box. Inside were dozens of original cylinder records in their original felt-lined boxes, mostly classical recordings from the Motnin Chinchamuese and Motnin Chinchaimes, cello solos, operatic tenors, string quartets. The acoustic library of the shop returned. James Whitmore was a boy of 16 who had failed his first semester of high school and was spending his enforced academic hiatus doing whatever came to hand in the Oakhaven community at his mother's insistence that the hiatus not become a permanent arrangement. What came to hand on a Wednesday morning in April was an introduction from Carl Whitfield, who sent James over to Foundry Street with a bag of hardware supplies, and a note that said, in Carl's economical way, James's good verkepte at his hands when directed. Give him something useful to do. James turned out to be useful in the specific way that 16-year-olds verkepgati hat, good spatial reasoning and no fear of physical work are useful. He could hold a piece of trim in position while Elara nailed it, carry heavy gramophone cabinets without complaint, and identify when something was not level with a reliable instinct that did not require a spirit level. He appeared on Wednesday and Saturday mornings, said very little, worked steadily, and at the end of the Saturday session at the end of April told Elara that he had gone back to school and was thinking about becoming an acoustic engineer, which was, Elara probably the best possible outcome of the whole arrangement. Reverend Anne Strickland was the pastor of the small congregational church on the north side of town, a compact, energetic woman in her lifties who walked the full perimeter of Oakhaven's downtown every morning at 6:30 as a form of moving meditation. She passed the end of Foundry Street every day, and from the day that Elara replaced the front window, she began turning down the street on her morning circuit to stop outside the shop for a moment. She did not come inside. She stood on the pavement outside the new glass, looking at the giant brass horn, and she would give a small nod of what seemed to Elara, watching from the inside, to be a kind of considered approval. On the first warm morning of May, she tapped on the glass with one knuckle, and when Elara opened the door, said simply, "Good morning. May the music be kind today." She said this every morning that followed without variation, and Elara came to organize her mornings around the expectation. The large wooden cabinet built into the corner of the back workroom had been used as a flat surface for holding broken motors during the first months of repair. It was a heavy piece, constructed of solid quarter-sawn oak verkepite at intricate mortise and tenon joinery. Elara had not, in those first cold, urgent days, opened its heavy doors or examined it carefully. In the second week of May, with the shop substantially restored and her daily routine settled into a workable rhythm, she returned to the cabinet with the particular attention it deserved. The doors were secured by a complex brass locking mechanism that did not use a key, but rather a sequence of sliding tumblers. Elara spent an afternoon studying the lock's internal geometry with a bright light and a dental mirror, finally deducing the combination, a sequence that corresponded to the mathematical ratios of a major chord in music. She engaged the final tumbler, and the heavy doors swung open. The interior smelled powerfully of cedar and old paper. The cabinet was not a storage space for parts, but an archive. Dozens of leather-bound ledger books filled the shelves, detailing every repair Silas Thorne had ever made, cross-referenced by customer name, machine model, and serial number. Beside the ledgers were stacks of technical schematics from the major phonograph companies Edison, Victor, Columbia, drawn in precise architectural detail. But it was the bottom shelf that held the true discovery. Resting on a piece of folded velvet was a flat, square tin box with a tight-fitting lid identical to the ones used to store early disc records. Elara opened the tin. Inside, folded in a neat square, was a heavy woolen army blanket, its olive-drab colour faded at the creases, and beneath the blanket a single folded sheet of paper, the handwriting a rounder, less certain version of Silas Thorne's letter script, as though written in youth. "For my brother Thomas, gone to the Argonne, October Mochin Mirtam, come home." Thomas had not come home. Elara did not Canove kept this yet with certainty, but she understood it from the weight of the note, the particular quality of the hope in it, and the fact that it had ended up in a sealed cabinet in a gramophone shop rather than in Thomas's hands. Beneath the note lay a single, flat disc record, pressed in early shellac. The label reader there, sung by Enrico Caruso. A song of war, preserved in the fragile medium of the era. Elara placed the tin box on the shelf above the testing table beside Silas's letter. She stood in the restored shop in the May light. The new glass, the refinished floor, the clean panelling, the display shelves. Verkepite had their carefully arranged gramophone cabinets waiting for motors, and she understood that she was standing inside something someone else had built with complete care and then been forced to leave, and that the leaving had been a kind of trust placed in the future without knowing the future's name. The spring in Oakhaven that year arrived hesitantly in the usual New England way, a week of warm days followed by a return to cold, the maple trees leafing out and then holding their new leaves against a late frost, the whole landscape in a kind of sustained negotiation between what it was ready to become and what the season allowed. Elara found the rhythm of this negotiation familiar and, in some way, instructive. The shop was not yet ready for its first customer. The Edison Triumph worked, but Elara knew that she did not yet know enough about the vast array of acoustic machines to offer professional repair service. She needed more time with the mechanisms, more careful practice, more patient repetition of the techniques she was learning from Silas Ledger's, the schematics, and the specific tactile knowledge that he had left encoded in the arrangement of his workroom. She was not impatient with herself about this. She had learned in the months since November that she had the capacity to learn things slowly and thoroughly, which was a different and more durable capacity than learning things quickly and approximately. She worked at the mahogany table in the evenings, disassembling and reassembling the broken motors from the display cabinets, building her understanding of how the gears meshed, how the governors regulated speed, how the tension affected the acoustic output. She was 23 years old by the time the first genuinely warm week arrived. She noted this the morning after her birthday, which she had spent alone, working on a complex Victor orthophonic reproducer until nearly midnight, with a quality of attention that was not sentimental but was attentive. She was a year older and substantially different than she had been at the moment she walked out into the rain in November. The shop was not done, she was not done, but the direction was clear and the work was honest, and the place she was going felt, for the first time she could remember, entirely her own. The gramophone shop was patient. So was she. The first gramophone she repaired for someone other than herself was a heavy, practical Victor NAM table model for Carl Whitfield, commissioned not because Carl had asked for it, but because Elara had decided that the first object she produced for the shop set inventory would go to the person who had made the inventory possible, and that Carl Whitfield, who listened to the radio in his store every morning regardless of the broadcast quality, and had never once owned a machine that did not require electricity, deserved a machine that would play music even when the power failed. She rebuilt the double-spring motor using parts from Silas S. inventory, ensuring the governor was perfectly calibrated for the standard Baymitam RPM speed. She restored the oak cabinet, stripping the old, crackled finish and applying new amber shellac by hand until it glowed. She rebuilt the exhibition reproducer, replacing the hardened gaskets to ensure the acoustic output was bright and clear. She gave it to Carl on a Thursday morning in November, 1 full year after she had arrived in Oakhaven. He looked at it for a long time. He turned the crank, lowered the needle onto the shellac disc she had provided, a Motninjchin Haimui Gay recording of a brass band, and listened as the clear, loud music filled his hardware store. He stood in the morning cold with the music playing, turning slowly, looking at the restore. He lifted the needle, stopped the motor, and hefted the reproducer once in his hand. Well, he said, and went back to his ledger. He played it every day for the rest of his life. The interior of the shop, 2 winters after that first November, had settled into a condition that Silas Thorne would have found, Elara believed, satisfactory. The display shelves held 20 fully restored acoustic phonographs in graduated sizes, each with a small card noting the motor type, the reproducer model, and the appropriate playing speed. The mahogany work table was level on all 4 legs. The broken joint had been properly rebuilt with a mortise and tenon repair that Elara had learned from a woodworking manual at the library, and its surface was clear and organized, the specific tools of the trade within reach of the seated position. The lathes and presses along the wall ran smoothly, cleaned and calibrated. The oak panelling gleamed in the morning light from the restored bay window. The cast-iron stove, properly vented and regularly cleaned, maintained the shop at a consistent working temperature throughout the winter. The pressed tin ceiling, cleaned and touched up where the pattern had flaked, reflected the lamplight in the evenings with a warm, gathered quality that made the room feel like something that had always been there and had simply been waiting to be restored to it. In the back workroom, on the shelf above the testing table, Silas S. letter sat beside the brown wax cylinder. Beside it sat the tin with the army blanket and the note for Thomas. Beside the tin, Elara had placed her own working notes, the record of every repair she had made to the shop, every technique she had learned, every supplier contact she had established, every price she had charged and what she had charged it. The whole documented history of the shop's return from dereliction to function, written in her own meticulous hand in the spiral notebooks that filled one section of the shelf in growing chronological order. It was Silas Thorne who identified the final element of Silas's legacy. On a morning in the 2nd November, when he came in with a broken clock motor and found Elara studying the cabinet in the back room. Silas rented the basement space in the building next door, Elias said, the way he said most things, as a statement rather than an assertion, carrying within it the confidence of someone who has identified what he is looking at correctly. The Parkers owned it, they re long gone, but the building's still there. Silas car iperte his heaviest stock down there. The entrance is through the old coal chute in the alley. Elara went to the alley next door, the narrow brick passage she had passed every day for more than a year without looking at, and found the iron door of the coal chute Elias had described. The lock was rusted shut, but a heavy application of penetrating oil and patience eventually allowed her to turn the. Inside the basement, dozens of heavy acoustic horns in various shapes and materials, wood, papier-mâché, brass, painted tin, a complete set of heavy casting molds for reproducing specific broken gears, a leather case of precision acoustic measurement tools she had not seen before, specialized tuning forks, decibel meters, a strobe disc for speed calibration that represented the most technical and expensive portion of an acoustic engineer-s kit, and at the back of the basement a wooden crate with a hinged lid inside which rested a heavy, complicated piece of machinery, an original Edison cylinder shaving machine, used for erasing wax cylinders so they could be recorded on again. It was a tool for renewing the medium, for allowing the music to continue. Elara brought the shaving machine and the precision tools back to the shop. She spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the machine and entering the tools into the inventory notebook. The disposition of the money from the brass horn required more time to settle than the repairs had, because money, unlike timber and metal, does not have an objectively correct application. It has many possible ones, and the selection among them is a moral rather than a technical problem. Elara had spent the winter and spring developing the basic logic of the shop's operation on the least possible investment of the found money, wanting to know what the shop could sustain on its own merits before introducing a larger financial resource. By the 2nd spring she understood the shop's operating realities well enough to make the larger decisions. She spent $5,000 on a modern electrical installation, proper wiring permitted and inspected, a circuit panel with sufficient capacity for the lathes and the lighting, and a small electric water heater, though she kept the cast-iron stove for heat. She spent $3,000 on a commercial bathroom installation in the back corner of the workroom, which required a plumbing connection to the main and the services of a licensed plumber named Graham, who did the work efficiently and without comment, and who subsequently sent his father to Elara for a replacement mainspring on a Victrola the father had inherited and valued. The remaining money, a substantial sum, Elara divided into 3 equal parts. One part she deposited in the shop account for operating reserves. One part she placed in a personal savings account she opened in her own name and did not touch. The last part she kept in a separate account labelled clearly in the bank's records as inheritance for the next one. The reopening of the shop as a commercial enterprise was announced by a single card, Elara, pinned to the corkboard at Whitfield's Hardware. Reading S. Thorne Gramophone Shop. Foundry Street. Acoustic machines repaired and restored. By appointment. The first appointment arrived within 3 days. A man named Arthur Pine, who had owned a Columbia Graphenola for 40 years, had never found anyone who understood the spring motor well enough to repair it without destroying it, and had heard from Silas Thorne that there was now someone on Foundry Street who might. Elara spent an afternoon with the Graphonola, a heavy, elaborate floor model with a seized motor and a shattered reproducer, and quoted Arthur a price that was honest relative to the work required and somewhat lower than the actual market value of the work, which she had researched. She repaired the motor using Silas S parts and the reproducer using the techniques she had learned from the ledgers. Arthur came to collect the machine 2 weeks later and stood in the shop for a long time looking at the finished work, turning the crank slowly. Mort kept not certain anyone could do this, Arthur said finally. Mort met glad to have been wrong. He paid Elara's invoice and left Elara a $50 gratuity with a note that said, in careful handwriting, for Silas. Elara put the note on the shelf above the testing table, beside Silas S. letter. 2 years into the Shop S reopened operation, Elara had a mailing list of 43 regular customers and a waiting list for restorations that ran 3 months. Her work had been noticed by 2 specialist dealers in antique phonographs in Boston and 1 in Albany, all of whom referred clients. The local historical society had written a short piece for the county paper about the restoration of the shop, which generated more attention than Elara had anticipated, and which she found slightly uncomfortable but ultimately useful. The work came steadily and required her full attention and grew in technical complexity as her skills developed. The commission that changed the Shop S character in a fundamental way arrived in the 3rd year, from a man named Julian Voss, a coincidence of name that struck Elara instantly, who ran an audio archiving program at a small private college in Vermont. Julian had been referred by the Boston dealer and came to see Elara on a Thursday in March, bringing 3 historic Edison machines from the College S collection that had deteriorated beyond the capacity of the College S in-house staff to repair. He spent 3 hours in the shop looking at Elara's work and asking technical questions that Elara answered vekepite hatte care, and at the end of the visit he offered Elara a position as a visiting consultant for a 2-week summer intensive on the mechanical restoration of early acoustic playback equipment, at a fee that Elara's bank account had not previously encountered. Elara accepted, and then spent the following months developing the curriculum, drawing on Silas S. ledgers, the schematics, the precision tools, and her own accumulated experience, and then delivered the intensive to 12 archiving students in July in Vermont, in a workroom with a high ceiling and good acoustics and a view of the Green Mountains, which were covered in summer green and looked nothing like New York's industrial valleys, but were beautiful in their own specific way. She returned to Oakhaven in August and found waiting on the work table a note from James Whitmore, the 16-year-old who had spent his academic hiatus helping her vekepite heart trim and leveling, saying that he had finished high school, been accepted to an engineering program in New Hampshire, and wanted to know if she had work for an apprentice before he left. She wrote back and told him to come by on Saturday. James turned out to be excellent at the mechanical parts of gramophone repair, the gear trains, the governor assemblies, the delicate spring tensioning, and he came on Saturdays for a year before leaving for college, which he described to Elara as entirely her fault for giving him something to point at when he imagined what honest engineering looked like. She took this as a compliment and he intended it as one. It was in the 4th year that Elara built the bench. She had been thinking about a secondary workbench in the back corner of the workroom for a long time, a place where an apprentice could work simultaneously without interfering with the main production, positioned close to the window for natural light but not in the path of the heavy lathe. She built it herself from white ash, which is a hard, resilient wood that takes a finish cleanly and does not easily dent or scratch under the metal tools of the trade. The joinery was mortise and tenon throughout, the same joint she had repaired in the mahogany table in her 1st year, and she cut the tenons herself with a marking gauge and a tenon saw borrowed from Carl S. store. The build took 3 weekends. When the bench was finished and in place, she stood back and looked at it for a long time. Then she sat at Motfi, her own work table, and wrote a letter. She wrote it the way Silas Thorne had written his, knowing exactly what she wanted to say before she committed it to paper, which gave it a particular quality of certainty in the lines, and addressing it to someone whose name she did not know. She described the shop. She described Silas. She described the wax cylinder and the note for Thomas. She described the tools and the ledgers and the brass horn and the new bench in the corner. She described the work of building something honest in the space that an honest person had left behind, the work of ensuring that the music did not stop. She put the letter in a cream-coloured envelope, sealed it with a wax seal using a stamp she had found in the desk, a phonograph horn in profile, very small, and placed it on the shelf above the testing table beside Silas's letter. She did not hide it inside anything. She left it in plain sight. Some machines are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The gramophone shop waits. It has always waited. And miles away, in the locked metal drawer of a county clerk's office, beneath a stack of archived deeds and transfer certificates and the accumulated paperwork of a century of small-town governance, were 4 deeply creased dollar bills, carrying in their worn surfaces the full weight of what $4 precisely spent can mean. The nature of acoustic restoration is fundamentally different from the nature of electronic repair. In a modern device, sound is data, zeros and ones processed by a microchip, amplified by solid-state circuitry, and pushed through a speaker cone using electromagnetism. The system is abstract, invisible, and operates at speeds that human senses cannot perceive directly. When it fails, the failure is often absolute and silent. A burnt transistor does not make a grinding noise, it simply ceases to function. Acoustic machines, however, are profoundly physical. Sound in a Victorian gramophone is not data, it is topography. The music exists as microscopic variations in the depth and width of a groove cut into shellac or wax. The machine's entire purpose is to drag a sapphire or steel point through that microscopic canyon, forcing the stylus bar to vibrate in exact sympathy with the terrain. This vibration is transmitted mechanically to a thin diaphragm, mica, glass, or aluminum, which beats against the air, creating sound waves. These waves are then gathered and directed outward by the horn. Everything in this chain is visible, tangible, and subject to the laws of physical mechanics. Friction is the enemy. Resonance is the goal. Elara learned this anatomy of sound not as a theory but as a daily physical reality. She learned to identify the materials by touch and smell. The heavy, dark wood of the cabinets, mahogany, oak, walnut, which had to be treated with specific oils to maintain their acoustic properties. The sharp, acrid smell of old shellac records when they were cleaned with distilled water and a drop of detergent. The distinct metallic scent of brass polish acting on oxidation, the cold, dense weight of the cast-iron motor frames. She learned to read the wear patterns on the gears. A mainspring barrel that was not perfectly true would cause a slight, rhythmic fluctuation in the turntable speed, a phenomenon called wow and flutter, which ruined the pitch of the music. A governor drive gear with a single worn tooth would create a mechanical knocking sound that amplified through the horn like a drumbeat. The microscopic jeweled bearings of the reproducer had to be perfectly clean and properly lubricated with clock oil, or the diaphragm would be constrained, resulting in a thin, tinny sound lacking in bass resonance. The work required a level of concentration that Elara found deeply grounding. When she was sitting at the mahogany work table, dissecting a seized motor verkep itehat tweezers and a jewelless loop, the world outside the shop receded entirely. The anxiety of her past, the constant low-level hum of unpredictability that had characterized her life in New York, was replaced by the immediate, solvable problems of tension and friction. A broken gear was not a tragedy, it was a puzzle. A seized bearing was not a crisis, it was a condition that could be reversed with solvent and heat. She began to catalogue the specific mechanical signatures of different manufacturers. Edison machines were over-engineered, robust, heavy, and complicated, reflecting the inventor's obsession with mechanical perfection. Victor machines were elegant, streamlined and user-friendly, designed for the mass market but built with surprisingly high-quality components. Columbia machines were idiosyncratic, often employing unusual spring arrangements or reproducer designs in an attempt to circumvent Edison's patent. Silas Thorne had understood all of this, and his ledgers were a masterclass in comparative acoustic engineering. He had noted not only how to repair the machines, but how to improve them. He had experimented with different gasket materials, rubber, cork, felt, to find the optimal combination for different types of music. He had documented the specific taper required for a horn to project a tenor voice clearly across a large room, versus the taper required for a string quartet in a small parlour. Elara spent the long winter evenings reading these ledgers by the light of the electric lamp, the cast-iron stove radiating heat against the oak panelling. She felt increasingly that she was not alone in she was engaged in a continuous, silent conversation with a man who had been dead for decades, a conversation mediated by brass, steel and the written word. She was learning not just how to fix machines, but how to listen. Julian Vance had taught her how to hear the structure of music. Silas Thorne was teaching her how to hear the structure of the machine that made the music possible. When she engaged the crank of a newly restored gramophone and lowered the needle, she did not just hear the song. She heard the smooth meshing of the gears, the silent expansion of the governor weights, the precise vibration of the diaphragm, the perfect frictionless tracking of the stylus. She heard the absence of mechanical noise, which was the true signature of a master repair. And in that absence, the music lived. The wax cylinder recording that Silas Thorne had left for her, the one she had played on the Edison Triumph, was not the only recording in the shop. As she explored the deeper corners of the back workroom and the basement next door, Elara discovered that Silas had been an archivist of a very specific kind. The commercial cylinder records she found, the ones Silas Thorne had returned in the cardboard box, were valuable artifacts of musical history. But in a locked wooden drawer beneath the testing table, she found something far more profound, a collection of personal recordings made on blank wax cylinders. Before the widespread availability of cassette tapes or digital recording, the phonograph was one of the few ways ordinary people could capture their own voices. Silas had owned an Edison shaving machine, which meant he could provide his customers with fresh, blank cylinders to record on. And occasionally, it seemed, customers had left recordings behind, or Silas had made recordings himself of people who visited the shop. Elara bought a modern digital audio recorder and a high-quality microphone. She set up a transfer station at the maple testing table, placing the microphone carefully in front of the horn of the Edison Triumph. She began the slow, delicate process of digitizing Silas' personal archive. The wax was incredibly fragile. Heat from her hands could soften it, a slight mishandling could scratch the surface and destroy the recording forever. She handled the cylinders with lint-free cotton gloves, inspecting each one under a magnifying lamp before playing it. The voices that emerged from the brass horn were ghosts pulled briefly back into the physical world. There was a recording of a local choir from Moinchin Tarm, the voices thin and reedy but unmistakable, singing a hymn that Elara recognized from her brief time staying at the church in Manchester. There was a recording of a town meeting from Moinchin Meeborn, debating the installation of electric streetlights, the voices raised in argument, capturing the specific cadence and vocabulary of early 20th century Vermont. There was a recording of a man simply reciting poetry, Whitman, mostly his voice deep and theatrical, clearly enjoying the novel experience of hearing himself repeated back by a machine. And then there were the personal messages. A woman wishing her sister a happy birthday. A father recording the sound of his child learning to read. A young man, his voice tight with nervous energy, recording a marriage proposal that had perhaps been too terrifying to deliver in person. These were the sounds of ordinary lives, captured in a medium that was never meant to last a century, preserved by the specific acoustic properties of the oak-panelled shop and the careful stewardship of Silas Thorne. Elara listened to these voices while she worked, the digital recorder silently archiving them for the future. She felt a profound sense of responsibility for these fragile artifacts. They were the auditory equivalent of the notes left in the brass horn and the cedar cabinet, messages sent into the future, hoping that someone would be there to receive them. She realized that her work was not duete about restoring the physical machines, it was about maintaining the connection between the past and the present. The gramophones were the bridge, the mechanism by which the voices of the dead could speak to the living. If the machines failed, the bridge collapsed, and the voices were lost. She made a decision in the spring of her third year. She contacted the local historical society and offered them the digitized copies of Silas' archive. She did not ask for payment. She simply stipulated that the recordings must be made available to anyone in the county who wished to hear them, and that they must be credited to the Silas Thorne archive. The Historical Society accepted with genuine enthusiasm. They set up a small listening station in their library, using a restored modern phonograph that Elara provided at cost. On the day the exhibit opened, Elara stood in the back of the room and watched as people from Oakhaven put on headphones and listened to the voices of their great-grandparents. She watched an elderly woman, Mrs. Higgins, who walked her terrier past the shop, listen to a recording and suddenly put her hand over her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Elara learned later that the recording was of Mrs. Higgins' father reciting a poem when he was a young man, a voice she had not heard in 60 years. Elara walked back to Foundry Street that afternoon feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with money or property. She unlocked the heavy red door in the alley, stepped into the shop, and smelled the familiar scents of old wood, oil, and brass. The shop was waiting for her. The machines were waiting. The work was waiting. She put 2 pieces of hardwood in the cast-iron stove, sat at the mahogany work table, and picked up her tools. There was a seized Governor Assembly on a Victor Bourne that needed her attention. And the music, as always, was waiting for someone to put the needle down. The process of repairing broken things is not inherently a metaphor, but it is very difficult to spend thousands of hours engaged in physical restoration without allowing the logic of the work to influence the way one perceives the world. Elara had arrived in Oakhaven as a person who had been systematically dismantled by circumstance, her structural integrity compromised by the slow, grinding friction of poverty and the sudden catastrophic failure of her grandfather S. She had been, in mechanical terms, a seized motor incapable of forward motion, locked in a state of high tension and zero output. The shop had unseized her. It had not happened quickly, and it had not happened through any mystical intervention. It had happened through the relentless, grounding necessity of physical labour. When she was on the roof replacing the slate, she could not afford to think about her mother S. abandonment. She had to think about the alignment of the courses and the placement of her feet. When she was rebuilding the Edison Triumph, she could not grieve for her grandfather in the abstract. She had to honour his teachings in the specific application of spring tension and gear alignment. The work demanded her absolute presence, and in demanding it, it provided a shelter from the past. But the true healing, the structural restoration of her own life, came from the realization that she was no longer merely surviving. She was building. The $4 she had handed to Ruth Barker had purchased a ruined building, but the $38,000 she had found in the brass horn had purchased time. Time to learn, time to fail, time to do the work correctly without the immediate, crushing pressure of starvation. She had used that time exactly as Silas Thorne had intended. She had not consumed the inheritance. She had invested it in the physical reality of the shop, translating paper money into maple flooring, glass panes, copper wire, and white ash benches. And in doing so, she had translated herself. She was no longer the frightened, exhausted 22-year-old girl standing in the rain with a canvas duffel bag. She was Elara Vance, proprietor of the S. Thorne Gramophone shop. She was a recognized expert in acoustic mechanical restoration, consulted by archivists and collectors. She was a business owner who paid her taxes, more than $4 now, on time and in full. She was a member of a community bound to Carl Whitfield and Reverend Strickland and James Whitmore and Elias Thorne by ties of mutual respect and shared labor. She had built a life with the same meticulous care she used to rebuild a gramophone motor, starting with the foundation, ensuring the gears meshed smoothly, applying lubrication where there was friction, and finally, listening for the resonance. On a quiet Tuesday in November, exactly 5 years after she had first walked into the shop, Elara stood at the front bay window and looked out at Foundry Street. The morning light was doing what it always did, moving slowly across the maple floor in Golden Square. The shop was warm, smelling of amber shellac and pine wood smoke. The display shelves were full. The lathes were clean. The white ash bench in the corner was waiting for James' younger brother, who had started coming by on Saturdays to learn the trade. She thought about Julian Vance, sitting in the damp parlour in New York, listening to the scratched shellac records until his hearing failed. She wished, with a sudden sharp clarity, that he could see the shop. She wished he could sit in the warmth of the oak-panelled room and listen to the Edison Triumph play the brown wax cylinder with perfect acoustic fidelity. But she also knew that he did see it, in the only way that mattered. He saw it in the skill of her hands, in the patience of her attention, in the fundamental belief that broken things are not worthless, but merely waiting for the right hands to find them. He had given her the vocabulary of repair, and she had written a life. She turned away from the window, walked to the mahogany work table, and picked up a specialized pair of pliers. She had a Victor orthophonic reproducer to rebuild before lunch, and the music was waiting. Some machines are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The needle drops. The cylinder turns. The voice speaks across the century, clear and resonant, amplified by the gleaming brass horn. It says that nothing is truly lost, as long as someone remembers how to fix the machine that plays the song. Before we go, tell us what you're refixing in your own life right now. And if this story brought you some peace, hit subscribe. We have more stories like this, waiting to be found.